My parents said I was never adopted. Then I found one envelope. I was 34 years old when my mother looked me straight in the eye, in the kitchen where I'd eaten 10,000 breakfasts, and told me I was being ridiculous. That's the word she used. Ridiculous. I had just asked her calmly, quietly, if there was something about my birth she'd never told me. And she laughed. Not a warm laugh. A short, clipped, dismissive laugh, the kind you give a child who says something embarrassing in front of guests. "Where is this coming from?" she said, and went back to drying the same plate she'd already dried twice. I want to tell you how I got to that kitchen because the answer isn't simple and it isn't fast. It took me most of a year to walk from a vague, itchy feeling in the back of my mind to a folder of documents sitting on my lap, documents that would eventually make my mother sit down at her own table and go pale in a way I had never once seen in 34 years of watching her face. My name is Nora. I grew up in a narrow brick house on Cedar Lane with my parents, Richard and Elaine, and my younger brother Tom. From the outside, we looked like the kind of family people wave to from across the street. My father coached Tom's baseball team. My mother baked for the church fundraiser every spring. I did well in school, I didn't cause trouble, and for most of my childhood, I genuinely believed I was loved the way a daughter is supposed to be loved. But there was always a low hum underneath things, a feeling I couldn't name until I was much older. Little differences that, on their own, meant nothing. Tom's baby pictures filled 2 thick albums with padded leather covers. Mine fit into a single slim one, and even that had gaps, months at a time with no photos at all. When relatives visited, they'd gush over how much Tom looked like our father, the same stubborn chin, the same way of tilting his head when he laughed. Nobody ever said that about me. Not once. I used to tell myself I looked more like my mother's side. I never actually confirmed that with anyone because somewhere inside me, a part one hadn't examined yet, I think I already knew not to ask. The thing about small inconsistencies is that they don't demand your attention. They just sit there quietly for years, until something forces you to finally look at the pile you've been stepping over. There was a specific memory that used to surface at odd moments, usually late at night, usually when I couldn't sleep. I was maybe 8 years old, sitting on the stairs in my pajamas, listening to my parents talk in the kitchen after they thought I'd gone to bed. I don't remember what led up to it, and I don't remember what came after, but I remember one sentence, clear as a bell, in my mother's voice. "We agreed we wouldn't tell her, not until she's grown, and maybe not even then." I didn't understand it at the time. I filed it away the way children file away things that don't make sense yet, in a drawer in the back of the mind marked later. I never told anyone about it, not even Daniel, until years afterward. I think some part of me was afraid that saying it out loud would make it real, and as long as it stayed folded up in that drawer, I could keep pretending it had been about something small. A surprise birthday party. A trip we weren't supposed to know about yet. Anything but what it eventually turned out to be. There was also the matter of my birthday itself, which my mother always celebrated with a strange, overcorrected enthusiasm, more elaborate than Tom's, as if she were trying to prove something to an audience only she could see. Big cakes, themed parties, photographers hired for milestone years. I used to think it meant I was the favorite. Looking back, I wonder now if it was something closer to performance, a woman working hard to convince herself, and everyone around her, of a story she needed to keep believing. For me, the thing that finally forced me to stop stepping over the pile arrived when my father died. He passed in March, a heart attack in his sleep, the kind of death people call peaceful, though I've never understood how anyone can know that for certain. I flew back to Cedar Lane for the funeral, and in the weeks after, I stayed to help my mother sort through his things, because Tom was too busy with work, and somehow it was always assumed that I would be the one to handle it. I didn't mind. I loved my father in the complicated way you love a parent who was warm sometimes and distant other times, and going through his closet, his desk, his old flannel shirts that still smelled faintly of cedar and aftershave, felt like a way of saying goodbye properly. His study still smelled like him weeks after he was gone, that particular mix of pipe tobacco he never actually smoked anymore but kept a tin of anyway, old paper, and the leather of his reading chair. I remember standing in the doorway that first morning I decided to clear it out, feeling like I was trespassing on something, even though he'd left me in writing the responsibility of handling exactly this. Sunlight came in low through the blinds and cut the room into thin, dusty stripes, and for a moment I just stood there, not ready to touch anything, the way you're never quite ready no matter how much time has passed. It was in that study, in the bottom drawer of an old oak filing cabinet that stuck when you pulled it, that I found the box. It wasn't hidden exactly. That's an important detail because later when I confronted my mother, she tried to suggest I had gone digging, snooping, invading privacy that wasn't mine to invade. But the box was simply there, unlabeled, wedged behind a stack of old tax returns from the 90s. I only found it because I was clearing the drawer out entirely, planning to donate the cabinet. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, and they were the kind of photographs that didn't fit into either of our family albums: hospital photographs, the sterile fluorescent kind, a newborn wrapped in a striped blanket, a date stamped in the corner in faded orange ink. I picked one up and turned it over. On the back, in my father's handwriting, was a single line. Nora, first day. Nothing strange about that, you might think. Except the date on the photograph was 11 days after the date I had always been told was my birthday. I sat on the floor of that study for a long time, holding that photograph, feeling something shift inside my chest, slow and cold, like a piece of furniture being dragged across a room upstairs. 11 days isn't nothing. But it also isn't proof of anything, not on its own. Hospitals misprint dates. Fathers misremember. I told myself that several times out loud, alone in that study, the way you talk yourself down from a ledge you're not even sure is a ledge. But then I found the envelope. It was tucked into the same box beneath the photographs, a plain white envelope gone soft and yellow at the edges with age. It wasn't sealed. Inside was a single folded piece of paper, and when I opened it, I found it was a letter, handwritten, addressed to my father. It began, "Richard, I know this isn't what either of you wanted, but I need you both to know she is healthy, and she is loved, and I trust you to raise her as your own." It was signed with a single initial, M. I read that letter maybe 15 times before I could make my hand stop shaking enough to fold it back up. The paper had gone brittle at the creases, thin as onion skin, and I remember being terrified of tearing it, as if the letter itself might be the only copy of a truth that could otherwise disappear entirely if I wasn't careful with it. I noticed on the second or third read, a small water stain near the bottom corner, a pale ring that had warped the paper slightly, and I found myself wondering absurdly whether it was a coffee ring from my father's desk or something else. A tear. I told myself not to read into it. I read into it anyway. Outside the study window, I could hear my mother's voice, muffled, on the phone with someone about funeral flowers, completely unaware that 11 feet away, in a room she rarely entered, her entire carefully constructed version of our family history was sitting exposed in my lap. I didn't tell my mother that day. I told myself I needed to think, needed to be sure, needed to not throw a live grenade into a house that was already grieving. But if I'm honest with you, the real reason I didn't say anything yet was simpler and more embarrassing. I was afraid. Afraid that if I asked the question out loud, I would get an answer I couldn't take back. As long as I hadn't asked, I could still believe in some small stubborn corner of myself that there was an explanation. A cousin. A family friend. Anything other than the obvious thing that letter was telling me. I flew home 3 days later without saying a word, the envelope folded inside a paperback in my carry-on like something contraband. For the next several weeks I tried to live normally. I went to work. I made dinner for my husband, Daniel, and our son Milo, who was 7 and going through a phase of asking why about absolutely everything, which felt, given the circumstances, almost cruelly appropriate. Daniel noticed something was wrong before I said a word. He's always been good at that, reading the weather in me before I've admitted a storm is coming. One night, after Milo was asleep, I finally showed him the letter and the photograph, laid out on our kitchen table like evidence in a case I hadn't decided to open yet. He read the letter twice. Then he looked up at me and asked the question I'd been avoiding asking myself. "Have you looked into your birth certificate?" I hadn't. It had honestly never occurred to me that a document I'd seen exactly twice in my life, once for a passport application and once for a marriage license, might be a lie sitting in plain sight the entire time. It took me 2 weeks to work up the courage to request a certified copy from the state. When it arrived, I sat with it unopened on the counter for an entire evening before I finally slit the envelope with a butter knife, my hands cold despite the June heat outside. The certificate listed Richard and Elaine as my parents. Nothing unusual there on the surface. But the file number in the corner had a suffix I didn't recognize. A small letter code I'd never seen on a birth certificate before. I spent that night doing something I never thought I'd be doing at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday. Researching state vital records, coding on my laptop, cross-referencing forms for adoptees, learning, slowly, painfully, that the suffix on my certificate matched the code used for amended records. Records that had been changed after the original was filed. Amended. Not original. Amended. I remember sitting back in my chair when I found that word, staring at the ceiling of my own kitchen, feeling strangely calm in a way that scared me more than crying would have. There's a moment when you're gathering evidence of something this big, where your mind seems to split in two. One half of me was devastated, quietly, steadily, grieving a version of myself I hadn't known I was allowed to grieve. The other half had gone almost clinical, taking notes, cross-referencing state statutes, printing out forum threads from other adoptees who had walked this exact road years before me and left behind, unknowingly, a kind of map for people like me to follow. I read through an entire online support community that night, adoptees in their 30s and 40s and even 60s, describing the exact moment they'd found their own amended certificates, the exact hollow feeling of realizing a government document, something you're taught your whole life to treat as unquestionable fact, had quietly rewritten your origin before you were old enough to object. Reading their words felt like being handed a hand to hold in a room I hadn't known was full of other people. There's a particular kind of grief that comes from realizing a document you've trusted your entire life was rewritten before you ever got to see it. It isn't loud grief. It's quiet, and it settles into your bones like cold water, and it doesn't leave. I didn't sleep that night. I lay next to Daniel, staring at the ceiling, running through 34 years of memories, watching them all tilt slightly, like a picture frame someone had bumped and never straightened. The gaps in the photo albums. The relatives who never said I looked like anyone. A comment my grandmother made once years ago before she passed, something about how your mother went through so much to bring you into this family. A phrase I'd always assumed meant a difficult pregnancy, and now sounded entirely different in my memory. I called the county records office the next morning and requested information on how to access a pre-amendment original birth certificate. The woman on the phone was kind but firm. In this state, original records for adoptees are sealed unless released by court order or unless the adoptee obtains consent or unless, and this was the detail that changed everything, the record is more than 30 years old and falls under an open records provision passed a few years back for exactly this circumstance. I qualified. I hadn't even known the law had changed. It took 6 weeks for the request to process. 6 weeks of going through the motions of my normal life while carrying underneath all of it the specific hum of waiting for a letter that would either confirm or dissolve everything I understood about myself. When it finally arrived, I opened it standing in my own driveway, unable to wait the 15 feet to get inside my house. My original birth certificate listed a different name in the mother's line. Marion Elaine Whitfield. Not Elaine. Marion. I stood there in the driveway with the paper shaking slightly in my hands, and I thought about the letter. Signed with a single initial. M. I want to be clear about something here, because it's easy in stories like this to imagine the moment of discovery as some kind of triumphant unraveling, music swelling, truth crashing down like a wave. It wasn't like that. It was quiet, and it was awful standing in my driveway on an ordinary Thursday, holding proof that my entire identity had a hidden first chapter that no one had ever planned to let me read. I didn't confront my mother yet. Instead, I did what I imagine most people in my position would do, though I couldn't have told you that at the time. I started digging. Quietly. Carefully. Because if there was a Marion Whitfield connected to my birth, and my father had kept that letter for 34 years without ever discarding it, I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with before I said a single word to my mother. It took surprisingly little time to find her. Genealogy sites, an old newspaper archive, a wedding announcement from decades ago. Marion Whitfield had a maiden name that, when I searched it more carefully, connected to a family 2 towns over. And then I found the detail that made my stomach drop entirely. Marion Whitfield was my mother's younger sister. My aunt. I had to sit down on the porch step when I found that. My aunt, who I had met exactly twice in my life at 2 funerals, a woman my mother always described in clipped, careful sentences as someone who wasn't well, and who we don't really talk about. I had always assumed that meant mental illness, addiction, something private and sad that a family simply didn't discuss out of kindness. I had never once imagined it meant this. I called my cousin Marion's son, a man named Peter who I'd only ever exchanged holiday cards with, and I asked him, as gently as I could manage, if his mother had ever mentioned giving up a baby. There was a long silence on the phone, long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then he said quietly, "She used to talk about a daughter she wasn't allowed to raise. I always thought it was something from before I was born, something that didn't survive. She never gave details. My dad told me once not to bring it up because it upset her too much. He agreed to ask her directly, and 3 days later he called me back. Marian was willing to talk. She was 71 now, living alone in an assisted apartment 2 states away, and when Peter put her on the phone, her voice was thin and careful, the voice of someone who has spent 34 years rehearsing what she would say if this call ever came, and still isn't sure she's ready. She told me everything in pieces over that call and 2 more that followed. She had been 19, unmarried and pregnant, at a time and in a family where that was treated as a catastrophe rather than a circumstance. Her parents, my grandparents, had been the ones to arrange it, not my mother, not entirely, though my mother had agreed to it and had, according to Marian, been the one who suggested the arrangement in the first place. Elaine and Richard had been married 3 years by then, and hadn't been able to conceive. It was presented to Marian, she said, not as a choice but as a solution everyone else had already decided on. She was sent to stay with a relative out of state for the final months of her pregnancy, and I was born, and I was handed to my aunt and uncle to raise as their biological child, and Marian was told in no uncertain terms that if she ever tried to have a relationship with me, it would destroy the family and destroy the story that had been built. "I wrote you 1 letter, she told me, her voice cracking in a way that made my own throat tighten. I gave it to Richard because I trusted him more than I trusted her. I asked him to keep it somewhere in case you ever asked, in case you ever wanted to know I existed. I didn't want to disappear from your life without leaving something behind." She told me about the months she'd spent away, staying with a distant cousin in another state, told to say if anyone asked, that she was finishing a semester of school early. She described the hospital room in careful, halting detail, the way people describe things they've replayed so many times in private that the memory has worn smooth in places and sharp in others. She remembered the exact color of the blanket I'd been wrapped in. She remembered, she said, counting my fingers twice because she'd read somewhere that new mothers always did that, and she wanted, even under those circumstances, to do at least that one thing right. "They let me hold you for 20 minutes, she said. "I've thought about those 20 minutes more than almost anything else in my life. I sat on my back porch with the phone pressed so hard against my ear it left a mark, listening to a woman I barely knew describe the day I was born with more tenderness and more detail than my mother, who had raised me, had ever once offered. My father had kept the letter for 34 years in a drawer that stuck when you pulled it. He never told me. I don't know if that was cowardice or loyalty to my mother or some quiet, private guilt he carried and never resolved. Some nights since I've imagined him standing in that study, letter in hand, working up the nerve to give it to me, and losing that nerve over and over for 3 decades. I'll never get to ask him which it was. That's its own small grief, separate from all the others, one I don't think will ever fully close. I sat with all of this for almost 2 weeks before I decided to go back to Cedar Lane. The reason I waited wasn't hesitation about the truth anymore. The truth was settled, documented, confirmed by 3 separate sources that couldn't have coordinated with each other. What I was doing in those 2 weeks was something else. I was building a folder. Not out of vengeance, not exactly, though I won't pretend there wasn't some of that mixed in. I built it because I knew with total certainty that if I walked into my mother's kitchen and simply said, "I know," she would do what she had always done with anything uncomfortable. She would deny it, reshape it, turn the entire conversation into a referendum on my own instability, my own ingratitude, the nerve of me digging through my dead father's things and inventing a story to hurt her while she was grieving. I needed the folder to be undeniable. I needed documents she couldn't argue with, laid out in an order that told the story before she had a chance to tell her version of it first. I made copies. The amended birth certificate. The original pre-amendment certificate with Marian's name on it. The hospital photograph with the date that didn't match the story I'd been told my whole life. The letter, still in its original envelope. And a printed timeline I'd built myself, dates lined up against each other, Marian's documented residence out of state during the final months of her pregnancy, the amendment filing date on my birth record, the date my parents had always claimed as my birthday versus the date stamped on the hospital photo. I also, and this detail matters more than it might seem, Requested my father's old bank statements from that year through the estate paperwork I was already handling as executor. Buried in 6 months of routine transactions was a single wire transfer, $800, sent to a name I now recognized as the relative Marion had stayed with out of state. Memo line. For M. $800 in that year was not a small amount. It was, as far as I could tell, essentially covering rent and expenses for the months Marion had been sent away to have me quietly out of sight, before being brought back into a family that would spend the next 3 decades pretending nothing had happened. I flew back to Cedar Lane on a Friday in late August. I told my mother I wanted to come help her finish clearing out the study, which wasn't untrue, just incomplete. Tom happened to be in town that same weekend, visiting with his wife and kids, which I hadn't planned but which in the end I was glad for. I wanted him to hear this too. Not to humiliate our mother in front of him, but because I was bone tired, of being the only person in that family who carried the full weight of a story everyone else got to walk away from. I want to describe that Saturday afternoon carefully, because it's the part of this that I've replayed the most since. We were in the kitchen. My mother was drying dishes, the same nervous habit she always fell into when something in the room felt unsettled, even before she consciously knew why. Tom was at the table with his youngest on his lap. I had the folder in my bag, sitting by the door, and for a long moment I almost didn't go get it. I almost let the whole day pass in ordinary conversation about the weather and Milo's summer camp, and whether Tom's oldest was going to make the travel soccer team. But then my mother said something offhand, about how she'd always known exactly what kind of daughter she wanted, and how grateful she was that things had worked out the way they did. And something in me, some patience I'd been rationing for 34 years, simply ran out. I got the folder. I didn't raise my voice. I want you to understand that because it matters. I have thought many times about the version of this where I slam the folder on the table, where I shout, where the scene becomes the kind of explosive confrontation you'd see in a film. That's not what happened, and honestly, I think the quiet version did more damage than shouting ever could have. I sat down across from her and I asked her to look at something. I slid the amended birth certificate across the table first, and then before she could say anything, the original with Marion's name printed clearly in the mother's line. My mother went very still. Her hands, which had been drying the same glass for almost a full minute, stopped moving entirely. "Where did you get this?" she said, and her voice had lost the sharpness it usually carried. It had gone thin. I told her. Calmly. I told her about the box in the study, the photograph, the letter, the phone calls with Marion, the wire transfer, and my father's bank statements. I laid each document on the table as I spoke, one at a time, like laying down cards in a game she hadn't realized she was still playing. Tom had gone quiet, his daughter still on his lap, looking between our mother and me with the expression of someone watching a building he'd always assumed was solid begin, slowly, to show its cracks. My mother didn't cry, not at first. What she did instead was worse in a way. She tried to reframe it. "We gave you a good life," she said. "We raised you as our own. Marion wasn't in a position to raise a child, and we were, and that's what families do for each other." She said it like a rehearsed line, and I understood in that moment that some version of this speech had been sitting ready in her for 3 decades, waiting for a day she must have known, somewhere underneath her denials, might eventually come. "I'm not disputing that you raised me," I said. "I'm asking why I had to find out from a drawer in a dead man's study instead of from you." She didn't have an answer for that. Not a real one. She said something about not wanting to confuse me as a child, about waiting for the right time that never quite arrived, about protecting the family. I let her talk. I didn't interrupt because I realized watching her that I didn't actually need her to apologize in that moment. I had already gotten what I came for. I had the truth, documented, undeniable, spread out on the table between us, and no amount of reframing from her could put it back in the drawer. At one point she reached for the hospital photograph, the one with the mismatched date, and turned it over in her hands the way you'd handle something you weren't sure was safe to touch. "This doesn't prove anything," she said, though her voice had lost its conviction by then, thin and unconvinced even to her own ears, I think. I slid the wire transfer record across the table next, the $800, the memo line reading for M, and watched her go quiet in a different way, the particular silence of someone who has just realized the story they've told for 30 years has a hole in it big enough to see through. "Your father shouldn't have kept that money on record like that," she finally said. and it took me a moment to understand what she meant. She wasn't disputing the truth of what happened anymore. She was criticizing his paperwork. In that single sentence, more than in anything else she said that day, I understood exactly how she had lived with this for 3 decades. Not through resolution. Through management. The facts had always been secondary to her. Something to be filed correctly, hidden efficiently, never actually confronted. Tom's daughter had grown restless on his lap by then, and he quietly asked his wife to take her into the other room, his eyes never leaving our mother's face. I don't think he wanted his own children hearing what was unfolding. Not yet, not until he understood it himself. When the door clicked shut behind them, he finally spoke, his voice low and careful. "Mom, just answer her. Is this true or not?" She looked at both of us, and for the first time in my entire life, I watched my mother run out of a story to tell. "Yes," she said finally, so quietly I almost missed it. "It's true." The quiet revenge in this story, if you want to call it that, isn't dramatic. I didn't cut her off. I didn't storm out. I didn't post the documents online or humiliate her in front of the extended family. What I did was simpler and I think in the long run far more lasting. I called Marian back that same evening, from a guest room in my mother's house, and I asked her if she would like to meet me. Really meet me. Not a phone call, not a careful monitored exchange filtered through decades of family silence, but an actual visit in person, where I could sit across from the woman who carried me and gave me up under circumstances she never chose. She cried on the phone. I did too. We arranged a visit for the following month. And then I did something my mother clearly hadn't anticipated. I told her plainly that I intended to have a relationship with Marian going forward, that Marian would be part of my life and Milo's life, whether or not that made my mother comfortable. I told her I wasn't doing this to punish her. I was doing it because I had spent 34 years without a piece of my own history, and I wasn't going to spend the rest of my life pretending that peace didn't exist just to keep the peace in a house built on a story that was never entirely true. My mother's face when I said that did something I had genuinely never seen it do before. It crumpled just slightly at the edges, the practiced composure finally slipping. "You're going to choose her over me," she said, and there was real fear in it, underneath the accusation. "I'm not choosing anyone," I told her. "I'm just done pretending I don't know what I know." That was the extent of my confrontation. No screaming, no ultimatum, no dramatic exit. Just documents on a table and a decision calmly stated that I would no longer participate in the silence that had shaped my entire life. The weeks after that were strange. My mother tried at first to enlist Tom against me, framing the whole thing as me being ungrateful, unstable, obsessed with digging up the past. But Tom had been in that kitchen. He'd seen the birth certificates himself, seen our mother's face when she couldn't explain the discrepancy, and he wasn't willing to simply take her side out of habit anymore. He called me a week later, quieter than usual, and said, "I always felt like there was something off about how she talked about you versus me. I just never had a reason to ask." That was its own kind of vindication, small and unspoken. A sibling finally seeing something I'd sensed my whole childhood but could never quite prove. I met Marian in person that September, at a small cafe near her apartment, 2 states away. I want to tell you that meeting was easy, but it wasn't. It was awkward in the specific way that meeting a stranger who is also, somehow, your mother tends to be. She had my exact hairline. I noticed almost immediately, the same slightly crooked smile I'd spent my whole life assuming came from nowhere in particular. She brought a small box of her own photographs she'd kept secretly for 34 years, pictures of herself pregnant, a single blurry photo of her holding me for the 20 minutes she was allowed before I was taken to my new family. She apologized to me over and over for a decision that, the more she explained it, sounded less like her decision at all and more like something that had been made around her, by people who had more power in that family than a scared 19-year-old ever could have had. I told her she didn't need to apologize for surviving a situation she'd been given no real choice in. I think that was the moment something in both of us finally softened. We sat there for almost 3 hours, past the point when the cafe staff started stacking chairs around us, and she told me things I don't think she had ever said out loud to anyone. About being sent away without being allowed to say a proper goodbye to the few friends she had. About coming home afterward to a family that expected her to act as though nothing had happened, to sit across the dinner table from the sister who was now, in the eyes of everyone she knew, raising her daughter as if it had always been that way. About the birthdays she marked privately alone every single year, never telling anyone what the date meant to her. About seeing me exactly twice growing up, at those 2 funerals, and having to shake my hand like a distant relative instead of embracing me the way every instinct in her body was screaming at her to do. I used to stand near the edge of family photos, she told me, staring down at her coffee, just so I could be in at least one picture with you, even if no one ever knew why it mattered to me. I thought about the photo albums back at my mother's house, the padded leather ones full of Tom's baby years, and my own thinner one full of gaps, and I wondered for the first time whether any of those gaps had actually been Marion, quietly excluded, quietly written out of a story that had never been fully hers to begin with. I didn't cut my mother out of my life. I want to be honest about that because I think there's a version of this story people expect where the wrong daughter walks away entirely and never looks back, and that's not what happened, and I don't think it needed to. What changed instead was quieter and, I think, more permanent. I stopped performing a closeness with her that had never been fully honest. I stopped calling every Sunday out of guilt. I started seeing her the way she actually was, rather than the way I'd spent 34 years hoping she'd eventually become. She never gave me a full, unguarded apology. Not really. What I got instead over the following months were small, halting admissions, a comment here about how young Marion had been, a comment there about how things were different back then, excuses dressed up as context. I've learned not to wait for the apology I know isn't coming in the shape I once imagined it. I got something else instead, something I think matters more in the end. I got the truth. I got my actual history, my actual mother's face across a cafe table, a relationship with a cousin I'd barely known, a fuller, more honest shape to my own life than the one I'd been handed as a child. There's a particular kind of peace that comes from simply knowing. Not from winning an argument, not from watching someone else's face fall when they realize you've caught them. Though I won't lie and say that moment in the kitchen didn't feel like something shifting back into balance after 34 years of tilt. The real peace came later, quieter in ordinary moments, showing Milo a photograph of Marion and explaining gently, in words a 7-year-old could hold, that families sometimes have more people in them than we first realize, and that's not something to be afraid of. My father's letter sits in a frame in my study now, not hidden in a drawer that sticks, but out where I can see it. I think about him sometimes, about the guilt he must have carried, keeping that envelope for 34 years without ever finding the courage to hand it to me himself. I've made a kind of peace with that too. He wasn't perfect. Neither was my mother. Neither honestly am I. But I know my own story now, the whole of it, not the edited version that was chosen for me before I was old enough to have a say. If you're listening to this and some small itch in the back of your own mind is telling you a story doesn't quite add up, a date that doesn't match, a relative nobody talks about, a silence around a subject that's just a little too careful, I tell you what I wish someone had told me years earlier. That itch doesn't usually go away on its own. It waits. And when you finally do decide to look, you may find that the truth, however uncomfortable, is still easier to carry than the not knowing ever was. I found one envelope in a drawer that stuck when you pulled it, and it gave me back 34 years of my own life that I hadn't even realized I was missing. I wouldn't trade that back for the comfortable version, not even now, not even on the hardest days since. The truth was heavier to carry at first, but it was mine. And for the first time in my life, that mattered more than keeping anyone else comfortable.